Ve y la otra con el juguete en la boca.
¿Y la muñeca qué?
¿Mm?
¿Y la muñeca qué?
Okay, everybody, good afternoon. Can everybody hear me okay?
Good afternoon. Yes.
All right, great. So glad to see all of you all again here today. We have gotten the exams graded, and I've returned via email the ones that I graded. If you haven't gotten your exam back, it should be coming in an email to you sometime in the next few hours. Let me think. I think students overall did pretty well. If you're not happy with your grade, maybe you feel like the work you put in was sort of doesn't correspond to the grade that you got, you can let us know, and we can try and find time to talk about how you can improve for next time. But I think overall most students did well, and you know, there's some basic things that we have to sort of keep in mind for the next exam, which will probably have the same format. The same things apply sort of trying to be specific and use detail when possible. And those of you who did that did very well. So I'm going to go ahead and sort of get the class started. Do you have any questions for me before I start lecturing? Okay, so last class we talked about sort of this continuing trend, right, of Taisho democracy. So we're going to pick up with that theme again today, and then we're going to move further into the 1920s and talk about why and how things begin to change very dramatically. So I'm going to screen share with you all. And okay, so as I talked about, this era of Taisho democracy, as it is called in Japanese history textbooks, Japanese literature, it's talked about as such. It was really a time of a lot of hope for a more progressive kind of Japanese government. I mentioned last class that Harake was prime minister who came in as the first prime minister who was not from these sort of super elite, who was he was elected and he was a bureaucrat, and then he became prime minister, and he really becomes the first important party prime minister of Japan. And under his leadership, we see a little bit of a bump in suffrage, 5% of men. And we also talked about Yoshino Sakuzo, and we also talked about Minoue Tsukichi as two figures whose ideas were somewhat controversial, but were widely respected and pretty well regarded, and didn't land them in any hot water when these ideas first came out. We also briefly discussed the sort of strange concoction of fascism and socialism and populism of Kita-Iki as well, all sort of bubbling over into the public sphere. Lots of discussion about these kinds of theories about the governance of Japan. We also talked about Article 5, right? Talked about the insurance law, factory law. The JCP was founded. Talked about the Suiheisha as well. So just a lot of things that are pointing towards more progressive governance in Japan, more inclusive governance, more sort of benevolent governance in Japan in the 1920s. We talked about the victory for progressive forces, the Universal Male Suffrage Law passed in 25, which gave all men over 25 who were not on welfare the right to vote. So a huge change, right? We also discussed the ways in which the peace police law that was passed the next day served to sort of dampen those hopes quite a bit, and that these sort of very vague conditions for being punishable or being imprisoned are laid out here in this peace police law. And you will probably hear in class a bit talk about the Japanese higher police or the secret police. there are actually several different bodies that are going to be working on or punishing individuals whose ideas are too far to the left or in their tone. So that also happens at the same time. And so I want to look at sort of this darker side today, and that's where things are going to be sort of continue to move from 25 on. But I also want to reach back a bit and show how Japan got to that point. So looking at how Japan developed in the Meiji period, there are some trends that are sort of dominant overall, and sort of this momentary dominance of and progressive ideas. It's unable to completely sort of overshadow these other important ideologies that are quite prevalent. One is collectivism. So these are actually going back in fact even to the Edo period of prioritizing the whole, belonging to the whole, and the sort of the good of the whole over the individual. And we also see in the Meiji period, we see the rise of a new kind of ism in Japan, authoritarianism, which was not part of Japan's history traditionally, right? So this is a European ideology that begins to have a lot of influence in Japan, partially because there is so much, so much Western ideological pressure on Japan, and the sort of a Western that's transitioning from absolute monarchy towards empire and towards authoritarianism, like Germany, for example, in particular, and its predecessor, Prussia. So that is a trend that we should keep our eye on. But there are these other four trends that I think are especially new, and are going to be very influential from the mid-Taisho period on, and they sort of actually begin during the Meiji period. They sort of begin to grow in that time period. One is radical ultranationalism. There was no nationalism from Japan up until perhaps we could talk about a nationalism that begins to blossom in the writings of Motoori Norinaga and his sort of his successor, if you will, intellectually, Hirata Asutane. These figures are talking about the beauty of their country and its traditions and its language, but the prevalence of this new kind of radical, oftentimes Shinto tinged ultranationalism is a very new modern feature of Japan that really breaks forth in the Taisho period and becomes influential, kind of under the radar, even as people are reading about the organ theory and about constitutional monarchy in a more progressive lens. We also see, obviously, a new development, Western-style imperialism becoming very influential and important for Japan as Japan looks towards the West, which at one point was sort of a threatening force that was making Japan open itself to trade for the West's benefit, in fact. And so here what we see is that Japan has figured out how itself to emulate Western-style imperialism. Today's lecture is actually, I think I gave it some title that sort of points to this sort of playing the game of empire like Europe has done, the US has done before. And this is what is going to happen for Japan. Militarism. This, I think, probably we could have seen it coming. The samurai class was very important. It was a large elite class in Japan. And although they're abolished, although they're sort of folded into this conscript army system, and they lose all their status and all of their position and their importance as samurai, the sort of ethos, right, of appreciating valor and the kind of intelligence and skills that go along with with martial arts and with fighting and with victory and protecting those who you're supposed to protect. All those things kind of carry over a little bit, and so I don't think it's safe to say that we can see sort of some sort of Bushido from the Edo period, or the way of the warrior that sort of transcends the bridge or the divide between the Edo period and the Meiji period. But there are some elements that are actually sort of looked back upon by Meiji figures and also Taisho era figures from the Edo period, and they sort of use these to advocate for the importance of the military, and that combined with the clear importance for Western imperial countries of their militaries really just makes Japan, it makes it almost inevitable that Japan is going to prioritize having a strong military. And I also mentioned this other sort of substrand here of anti-elite or anti-oligarchy populism, which is really a reaction against the Meiji oligarchs, right? The Meiji, the Satsuma Choshu figures who are so, dominant and who really pull all the strings during the Meiji Emperor's rise to power and then his reign. So these are things I just want to kind of put out there, some ideas to look for, and we're going to go into a few of these today in more depth. 1915 is a pivotal year for Japan. This is sort of this is a point where we've already seen that Japan uses gumbo diplomacy to force Korea to open its doors to trade with Japan in 1876. And we see Japan fighting against China and defeating China in part over this new informal, not yet colony of Korea, and then taking parts of China, like taking Taiwan, for example, as its colony. And then we see Japan colonize Korea in 1910. So Japan is a true Western-style imperial power by 1910. By 1915, we see the Japan it really sort of tries to take this to the next step. The Taisho government issues the 21 demands to China. Now, China has been sort of the punching bag for the West since the Opium Wars, and they've just been taking pieces over of its coasts, and then with Japan's victory over China and the Boxer Uprising in 1800, we just keep seeing more and more of China being sort of sacrificed to international control. And Japan has, in their view, the right to be part of that, and perhaps even to be a brake upon too much Western imperialism for China. So the 21 demands are sort of a list of demands that are issued actually during World War I, when the West was kind of busy with other things, and they're meant to strengthen China, but also to make China a better partner for Japan at the expense of China. So, I've just got a few of the demands here, or few of the kinds of things that are being demanded of them. I mentioned that, for example, that the Japanese require that Chinese seek Japanese consent if they want to build new railroads, or if companies want to acquire loans to build new railroads, Japan has to approve those. Companies that are going, companies that are Japanese in China are also, they're in this document supposed to get the right to build schools and hospitals and also Buddhist temples, interestingly enough. And in doing so, they also allowed with these institutions to also own actual land in China. So this is another step towards occupying and owning pieces of China. They're supposed to agree to a joint Sino-Japanese police force, which actually is overseen by Japanese police experts. The same is mostly true for the Sino-Japanese armory, which would mean that Chinese, the military of China would have to seek Japanese authority or permission to use its weapons. So these are the kinds of things that were mentioned, but I want to mention a few more that are also very important. With the increasing ostracization of Germany during World War I, and their inability to take care of their holdings in an area called Shandong, which I'll show you in a second, Japan sort of just takes over the Shandong Peninsula. And this treaty basically wants to formalize that and say that Japan will be able to hold this territory and have control of this territory in China. And perhaps the most important, looking sort of backwards and forwards for Japan, is its lease on the South Manchurian Railroad Zone for 99 years, including extraterritoriality. So this is a very decisive step for Japan to claim that they are now the ones who should not, they're able for a long period of time to have a sphere of influence and have control over the area that is today Manchuria. So this is also one of their very important demands. The Chinese government does not want to do this. By 1915, let's see, is the emperor yet? The person in charge of China is Yuan Shikai, who has replaced we've already ended the Qing dynasty in 1911, and so now we have this other kind of government that's leading China. So he is trying to deal with a lot of local warlordism in China, and is unable to entirely throw off Japan's demands. So initially there's a boycott of Japanese goods, and this leads to a pretty significant export crisis for Japan. But in the end, Yuan Shikai has to agree to most of the demands. He gets to 13 least aggressive, and I've mentioned the ones that were least aggressive a second ago. A few of them, or most of them actually, do happen. And the world is also watching this and watching Japan try to be a Western imperial power, and the Western countries are sort of shaking their head that Japan shouldn't be able to do these kinds of things. And so we talked about the 1902 Anglo-Japanese alliance. That begins to weaken, right? Great Britain is worried that Japan is going to push them and also perhaps other Westerners out of China and take it for themselves. So that's happening. And this is part of Japan's road towards being an imperial country, but also a Western-style imperial country. And this is happening even as we talk about all of these liberal elements like women's magazines and literary journals and you know, the more democratic ideals and approach to government of Yoshino Sakuzo. So this is, by the way, Shandong Peninsula here, and this is Qingdao, which is a very big port city, and this is the area that Japan claimed during Germany's absence from China. And in fact, actually, to make a long story short, actually, Japan had already tried to take over Shandong before and not been allowed to do so as part of the Triple Intervention. And this area here in green is the it's China's northernmost province, but 6 provinces, I should say. But it's also the area that will be referred to as Manchuria. This is the area where the South Manchurian Railroad was being built, and that Russia and Japan had fought over, and that Japan now was able to invest in and to do mining and to build industries like chemical industries, those kinds of things, and that this new agreement would give them a 99-year lease upon. We talked about Korea. I'm not going to go over Korea again today, but I do want to sort of point to the disconnect between sort of this more liberal set of policies that eventually lead to, you know, universal male suffrage in Japan, and Japan's continued sort of, you know, they're using Korea as a resource for human resources and also food resources after 1910. So I guess it is important to mention that, you know, there is a time period during which things are a little bit less terrible in Korea, and those come after the March 1st movement, which we discussed very briefly. When young and old Koreans rush into the streets in a nationwide protest to proclaim that they were an independent country and they should not be forced to stay as a colony of Japan. And if we look over to China, in that same year, we have Chinese frustration at Japanese encroachment and the 21 demands and the May 4th movement of 1919, just a couple months later, takes place in Tiananmen Square, in which they proclaim that their country is beautiful and it's been an unfair victim of Japanese imperialism, among other things. So all of these sort of elements point to Japanese oppression of non-Japanese peoples over on the continent. And so this is sort of the other part of this democracy. So I guess my point is that if it's easy to see Taishan democracy as a strange sort of an anomaly or a weird moment in Japan's development as democracy. But given that this is happening in the background, this is a corporate investment, military presence in China and in Korea and in Manchuria, and somewhat also in Taiwan. These elements are very much part of the story, and they never went away. And so I mentioned several isms. These are all tied to those isms that are sort of continuing for Japan. A few more things. So Japan is trying to establish itself as a great power and making good progress in doing so, as we've talked about between 1895 and 1915. During World War I, Japanese military actually is deployed to Siberia to, in theory, try and put down the Bolshevik run that's happening, and that has obviously taken the royal family and executed them, and has thrown the country into chaos, but also as a way to try and stabilize that front, so that the Russians can help then fight against Germany. Now there's several pieces to this story, but basically the Western countries were happy that Japan took part in this part of World War I. But when Western armies left, Japan stayed until 1922, and so this is Japan sort of overstaying its mandate in Russia, and clearly sort of weakening Russia that could have been a threat to its interests in East Asia. So the Western countries like France and the US, Great Britain, are not happy about that. The Treaty of Versailles, 1919, that ends World War I, is a moment when Japan argues that it should be seen as a world power, given all of its accomplishments and all of its efforts to conform to Western norms in terms of empire and economy, but also civil rights and all those kinds of things. But in another move that the Japanese found very unfair, the Western country at the Treaty of Versailles refused to acknowledge that Shandong belongs to Japan. This sort of nullifies their hold on that territory. So this is another moment like the aforementioned triple intervention, where Japan has taken something, a territory, through means that its model countries in the West have used to take territories before, but they're told that you can't do that, right? You're not allowed to do that. And so this is sort of they're really trying to find a way forward here that will allow them to show that they're equal to the West, and the West each time sort of says, no, you're not equal to the West. The same year, the League of Nations gets its start, and Japanese request. This is the Treaty of Versailles. discussion was happening, and here we have Japanese delegation here, which includes some people many people from generals to Christian ministers to foreign ministers to many others who are there to make this case. So in 1919, League of Nations that established an effort to try and avoid future wars like this World War. Japanese ask that they want to join, and they do, but they also ask that a racial equality clause be included in the charter of the organization, and the organization refuses to include that charter. President Woodrow Wilson and himself refuses to include that in the charter for this organization. So another slap in the face for Japan, right? And this is the League of Nations here. And then 22, Great Britain, the United States, and Japan come to the table to discuss the future of their armaments and in DC, they have a conference about the Navy, and Japan had hoped to have the right to expand its military, its Navy, to the same portion as the United States and Great Britain, because it was, after all, again, a real world-class imperialist country that had followed all the rules. But Great Britain and the United States, they turned this request down, and they forced Japan to accept a ratio of 5-5-3. So for every 5 battleships that Great Britain and the US can build, Japan can only build 3. So they're trying to dampen Japan's military growth, and this hurts. As you will discuss, I think tomorrow in your sections for discussion, the kinds of racism that Japanese faced in the United States were pretty impressive. And they clearly sort of bore out the kinds of racism that was at the heart of the refusal by the League of Nations to put in a racial equality clause, by the Washington Naval Treaty, all these things. So if you go back a little bit, 1907, Roosevelt and Japan's prime minister come to an agreement to limit Japanese immigration to the United States. They avoid an actual sort of immigration ban or a quota, but they come to an agreement that will basically only bring a small number of Japanese for that time period to the United States. And this is actually happening because there's a growing atmosphere of white frustration in California, in particular on the West Coast, who are saying that the Japanese are taking their jobs, that they work too hard, that they're making it harder for them to do their jobs. Things that we obviously hear a lot today in the United States, and each time these are typically very erroneous claims. But anyway, there was violence against Japanese immigrants, and Japanese American communities that had already been in the United States for sometimes decades. And then, as you'll talk about tomorrow, there are just a lot of efforts to try and satisfy the angry population of white Western Americans who were trying to kick out the Japanese, essentially. In 22, another interesting law that is passed. This is a prohibition of Japanese naturalization. So this essentially revoked American citizenship from Japanese, and it blocked future Japanese nationalization to American citizenship. And this is a very if you can imagine, if you had come to the United States as a Japanese individual and you became American, it would be very tough for you. And it was. This was their country too. They thought they had they were immigrants like the Italians or the Irish. They belonged to this country, but they were told in this case that they did not. Immigration Act of 24 fully stops immigration from Japan. So you can look at that more tomorrow. But these are sort of things that are just adding up, right, to the Japanese feeling of being a victim, of being unfairly treated, of being always being told that they aren't good enough. And this is a big element, right, that I think stokes the flames of needing to make Japan into a stronger country so that it can prove without a doubt that it is stronger than even a Western country, right? And so that's part of why I think Japan veers away from democracy, is because it wants to be that strong country with a strong, rich country with a strong army that can sort of totally defy Western expectations and justify being called perhaps the most civilized country. So I want to talk lastly today about some of the ideologies that are also developing. We talked about the military being in place in Japan's colonies, usually to oversee Japanese investments in those places like the railroad or the mines on the continent or in Taiwan. And so we have business and we have the military there. But there are also important ideological elements that I want to talk about. And I want to focus in particular on ultranationalism. And these actually, again, go back to Meiji period, but they sort of, again, flourish in the 1920s. So this is an image here of another professor at the Imperial University, Hozumi Yatsuka, who would have been in the same building as Yoshino Sakuzo. But he studied in Germany, and he was very interested in how Western countries thought about monarchy and nationalism and national identity. And so when he comes back to Japan and becomes a professor, he writes a book called National Education Patriotism, which is really a blueprint for Shinto ultranationalism. And I've got a few of the key ideas here. So one of the ideas is that the emperor is the essence of Japan's political entity, like he embodies it. If you criticize the emperor, you're criticizing Japan's national being, national body. And this is why this particular language in 25, right, shows up again in the peace police law. The key idea is the Koka Kazoku, the family state, that the Japan is a family state, right? That the country is, people of the country are tied together by blood, so it's an ethnic nation, and that the blood ties of the Japanese make them a family that has, an actual father figure who's the emperor, and that the Japanese owe loyalty to the emperor as this father figure. So he's really drawing on these sort of long-standing Neo-Confucian norms to make this argument. But he goes into a great depth about Japan as an ethnic population, ethnic nation. It's actually a German idea. The term in Japanese, minzoku, was actually a translation of the term Volk, right? So the people, the people of Germany who will eventually be calling themselves the Aryan descendants, right? Are talking about what it means to be German, and not to be from another country, another culture, conflating culture and identity with their nation state. He borrows that, and he uses that from Japan, and he argues that the way to maintain this and for it to prosper is to have an absolute monarchy, drawn from a lot of Western European ideals, but that have by this point actually gone out of fashion in Western Europe. In the 1910s and 20s, another couple of figures I want to talk about today become very influential, and they essentially are sort of building off the ideas of Hozumi Yatsuka, but they're also part of this same Shinto ultranationalism. And I mentioned Shinto because they're not actually talking about going to a shrine and worshiping the kami. They're talking about the sort of a secular Shinto that we saw appearing in the Imperial Educational Rescript in 1890, and we'll see it in other places as well. That you can be of any religion in Japan. They'll actually figure that out in 1899, the government, but you have to still abide by these ideals, which are justified because the emperor is at the very least, the embodiment of the sun goddess, if not her actual sort of her actual descendant. So anyway, I want to talk about two figures here. Lastly, who are very influential in sort of fomenting this Shinto ultranationalism. One is Uesugi Shinkichi, who we see here, professor at the Army Academy, and also at the Naval Academy in Tokyo. And he lectures, but does not actually work at the Imperial University full time. But so he is going to write a lot of he's going to write sort of new theories that are trying to sort of transform how people in Japan and the emperor are connected. So in a very complicated fashion, he basically explains that people of Japan are what they want is the same as what the emperor of Japan wants, and that they sort of have, because they're part of the same thing, the same being, if you will, and that what's happened is all of the politicians have gotten in the way of that. They sort of have gotten in between the people and the emperor. This idea may sound familiar because it was already a point made by Kitaiki, which he has clearly sort of drawn upon in his arguments. So he's arguing that we don't need these politicians who are there looking for their own financial or political gain to interpret the imperial will of the people or to tell the emperor what the people want. The emperor innately knows what people of Japan want, right? Because he is a father figure to them and tied to them in that sense. And he's also arguing against democracy as a way to make Japan prosper. For Japan to be a strong military and imperial country, the emperor needs to really directly have control. And this again is sort of talking about looking back at the evolution of Japan in the Meiji period, and all these figures who were exercising power through the emperor. People like Ito Hirobumi from Choshu and those from Satsuma and from Tosa as well. So this is a critique of all that system and that oligarchy and trying to remove all that and have the emperor really rule directly. These ideas are being taught to a lot of Japanese cadets at the Army and Navy academies, and what we'll see is that these students will actually go on to become officers in the imperial militaries, Army and Navy, and to try and sort of help this to happen, right? To try and catalyze this transformation to actually take place. And lastly, I'm going to mention Kake Katsuhigo, who we see here, another professor. He teaches at all three places as well. And he, again, a very complicated theoretical formulations in his writing, but in his teaching, it's much clearer and much more direct. He argues that Japan does not have any individuals, that Japan is a nation state, a national body that works as one whole unit. And so there's an idea of the individual being sublimated or obliterated, right? And then he's arguing this has to happen. And the ways that you do that are by emphasizing loyalty to the emperor, pride in Japanese nation, and then helping Japan to realize its own manifest destiny, which is to take over and improve the lot of Asia. And an important sort of glue for all this is Shinto, and that the emperor is the head priest, not only of Ise Shrine, but of a national Shinto that can make all of this happen. And I mentioned before, I mentioned collectivism as one of these important forms of continuity. Here we see it sort of reach its pinnacle, its apex with this idea. So these ideas also are being taught to students at the Imperial University, but mostly at the academies for the military. And the students are going to go off and they're going to be having lots of other ideas as well, but they're going to be really attracted to these ideas and trying to make them happy. So what we have is essentially we'll have two factions in the 1930s, getting a little bit ahead of ourselves here, but who are going to be looking back to these ideas of Kakehi and Uesugi. And those who are attracted and who are loyal to Kakehi are going to be part of the control faction, the most members of the Navy. And this faction is looking for a dramatic reform of Japan that will get rid of all of the kinds of political infighting and indecisiveness and unpatriotic sentiment in Japan, but gradually, right? And through channels that are not going to be revolutionary. Whereas those who are following Uesugi Shinkichi and his ideas are mostly tied to the army, are going to be part of a faction called the Imperial Way faction. And this faction in the 30s is going to be talking about dramatic and radical change right away, right? To get rid of all the politicians who are in the way and all the sort of wishy-washy progressive ideas that are weakening Japan. And they both want a Japan that's going to be strong in the international stage and able to face the West, right? And this is where, so we'll see how those develop next class. And so as you read Barefoot again, you're going to sort of encounter some of the result of these kinds of ideologies, what they sort of how they turn out. I'm going to talk about one last figure here, and then I'm going to move on to well, I'll probably take if you have any questions and then let you go. So the last part I want to talk about is we have the military, we have corporations and big companies, we have who are very interested in the continent, invested in the continent. We have the ideologies of ultranationalism that have been sort of brewing since the late 1890s, but become very influential in the 1920s and even more so in the 1930s, and also very sort of applicable and practical and sort of pragmatic. I want to talk lastly about violence, and this is going to be a thing we'll talk about more next class. But if we go back to the 1880s and 90s, a society called the Black Ocean Society was established to try and show the people how can I put this, as sort of like a fraternity, right? Of people who are like-minded, from business, most from the private sphere, and who really want to carry forth the ideals of the Restoration, which was that around the imperial family. So they want to honor the imperial family. They want to instill respect for the empire and the people of Japan and guard the rights of Japan's people. But they also want to promote Japan's expansion overseas in terms of economic expansion and military expansion. And to do so, rather than working through the channels of elected government or through I don't know, education, as is happening later on in the hands of Uesugi and Kakehi, they do so through these sort of backdoor channels like terrorism and blackmail, extortion, and organized crime. So if someone is threatening the honor of the imperial family, they may end up, in the sights of this society. Now, initially, this society was relatively small and kind of a secret society, actually. But its ideals and goals become more well known. It sort of disbands, but a leading disciple of this group founds another society called the Black Dragon Society, the Kokuryukai. And this society is more public. It's much less ashamed of its goals, and we have people who are in high-ranking positions in the military or in the cabinet or in the government who are going to subscribe to the journal or the magazine of this organization. They're going to give a lot of money to the organization, and they're going to avoid saying bad things about the espionage and the sabotage and assassination that happens in the name of this society. This here is a picture of Ushida Ryohei, who is the person who makes this new group, Kokuryukai, work, and who also is sort of a wanderer. He actually finds himself in Korea and in Manchuria, making negotiations, doing things that will help, again, the interests of business and of the military on the continent to flourish, and to hopefully justify Japan colonizing those areas. So I'm going to sort of end with that for today, with this. So we've seen all the different pieces that are in place, and that are growing and taking shape, even though we have these democratic things happening at the same time. Business and the military and these sort of ideologies and these illicit under the table operations are drawing Japan further and further into the continent, and suppressing at the same time the rights of the people living in China, Korea, and the future Manchuria as well. So that's all for today. Be sure and read Barefoot again. Thanks for listening, and I will see you all on next Tuesday. Have a great rest of your day.
Thank you.
Thank you. Have a good weekend.
Thank you.
Thank you,
Thanks.
Professor.
Have a good one.
Thank you.